This is a book that was sent out by Vanderbilt to everybody at Vanderbilt unsolicited. It was a real YouTube move. Welcome back to my YouTube channel. I am Adri Cortee. I'm a fourth-year PhD candidate at Vanderbilt University, and the goal of my channel is to make academia entertaining and accessible for you. So if that sounds good, please make sure to like and comment and subscribe. Today, I'm going to be talking about this book called A Year Like No Other by Ryan Underwood. This is a book that was sent out by Vanderbilt to everybody at Vanderbilt unsolicited. It was a real YouTube move. This book is described as how a global pandemic led to Vanderbilt University's proudest moment. And Ryan Underwood, who wrote the book, is a director of editorial strategy at Vanderbilt University and editor-in-chief of Vanderbilt magazine. A lot of people were really unhappy about this book, people within the Vanderbilt community. And Vanderbilt is telling this heroic story about how they handled COVID as COVID is still happening. So that's just a little suspicious to write history as it's happening, as if it's sort of come to an end. Another problem is that it's rumored to have cost the university a lot of money to write this book and then print it and then send it out to every person at Vanderbilt. I won't say the number because I don't know if it's true, but the number I heard was incredibly high for how much it cost them amongst a time where they're saying, things are hard, some people can't get raises, all of these things, but they find it in the budget to send this book out. I went to the Amazon page for this. It has a 1 star out of 5. And I'll just give you a synopsis of what people are saying. They say, thanks so much for the kindling, utterly tone deaf, the pandemic isn't over, just creepy propaganda, it's out of touch with reality to the point of being fiction, flatly, this is propaganda, insult to Vanderbilt's community. There's also an article that I'll link below from the Vanderbilt Hustler magazine talking about how it is kind of supporting an agenda that is Vanderbilt propaganda. That being said, I'll have a quick disclaimer that I think Vanderbilt did a lot of good stuff during the pandemic. They were heavily involved in the research and development of the vaccine, which was super important. A lot of faculty did step up and learn how to use Zoom to still have instruction online during a really hard and tough time. Vanderbilt was trying to find unique ways to get people to still spend time together on Zoom events and all of these things. I'm not going to say that it was a failure on Vanderbilt's part. I think it was a hard time. It wasn't my agenda without this book to critique how Vanderbilt handled the pandemic. Of course I had opinions, but I wasn't going to publicly talk about them. But they sent this out and they precipitated a conversation. So now, because they sent this to me, I critically read it and I'm making this video. And so this video is probably gonna be in 2 or 3 parts because there's a lot to talk about with this book. And so stay tuned and make sure to subscribe so you don't miss the other parts of this video to hear more about just the rich, rich text that is A Year Like No Other. First, I'll talk about sort of just 2 major themes that I found in the book, and then we'll get into part 1. So one of the first major themes I found, there is a disparity amongst how men and women are presented, what titles they're given. And this is actually a thing kind of in the academic community that you'll hear stories from women in academia who have PhDs, who have, these high positions, not being called doctor, not being called a proper title when they're addressed because they're women. And so when I first started reading the book, it's actually sort of just casual observation I made about the book that I would see him name women and he wouldn't call them doctor. I'm in the Vanderbilt community, so I would know some of the women he was naming, and I'm I know 100% that she has a doctorate, and he's not naming her by doctor. So I went through every person that was named in this book. And yes, it took me hours, and yes, I am a crazy person, but I did this. And I will link down below Excel sheet I made with all of the people named, male and female, and then the different categories I put them in. But basically, there is 5 different colors of this graph that mean different things. And this magenta means that they are not a doctor, but they're given a proper title. So even it could be someone's job title of Associate Chancellor of Libraries and Sciences, and then the person's name. What is green and blue? So these are both under the category that they are doctors. Okay, they have PhD, they have MD, but they are not described as doctors. So in green, although they are not described as a doctor, they're still given a proper title. So like I said, it could be Professor Norris instead of Dr. Norris. It's still a proper title. In blue, they are not given a proper title. The way I interpreted this is if You would say my name if I had a doctorate, maybe one day. You would say Adriana, comma, professor of biological sciences, all in like lowercase, which I do not consider a title because it's after my name in lowercase. And then in yellow is described as a doctor. Like he actually described them as a doctor when they were a doctor. And then in gray is other, because he does have a lot of like anecdotes from undergraduates and stuff, and they don't really have a title. Like he'll say Vanderbilt student and then their name. That's not really their title or proper title. So those things I couldn't put in other. So this is what I found. For males, basically 33.9% that are not a doctor are still given a title. Of the females of this category, only 22.7% who are not doctors were given any proper title. In green, the ones that are doctors, not described as doctors, that were still given a proper title, 23.7% of the males, 13.6% of the females. In blue, these people are doctors. They weren't described as such, and they weren't even given a proper title. So this is sort of like the most, I feel, insulting one in blue. They're not even calling you professor anything, doctor anything. They're just basically saying your name and then commas some description. And so for men, 15.3% he did this, and then females, he did this 25% of the females. One of the strangest things was that when it came to just the category of described as doctor, just doctor in front of the name, for the men, he did 6.8%. He actually described as doctor. For the women, it was 2.3%. And the raw number of that, there's only one woman he actually put DR in front of their name. I'm not gonna make any like summary about this, that Ryan Underwood did this and this is on purpose. I think this is just something that could spark a conversation of why women are not given the same proper titles or called doctor as much as men are. I will say it seems like he's sort of bad at just giving people the correct title, because the males, it wasn't, he was just calling them all doctor. He's also sort of giving them weird titles. So I won't say it's just women, but I will say it's women to a higher degree. Women in academia deserve to be called doctor, deserve their proper titles. That's the first thing I noticed. The second theme is glorifying hard work, and sort of just a propaganda tone. So I'll just go through and sort of read you each time I noted the glorifying of, these long hours. I don't mind people working long hours. I work long hours. Like, I'm not gonna pretend like I'm like anti-working hard. I'm anti-working hard when you don't get more return for the more hours you put in. Like, I don't think that just working hard and not getting something in return should be glorified. Like, I wouldn't mind if they put in this book all these times people work so hard, and then like also said after that, oh, they got a raise. Oh, I don't know, raise their pension or what is it? That thing that all the savings goes into? What is that? I obviously don't have one. Oh, the 401k. It just seems like talking about hard work without talking about how you made the worker's life better in any way just seems sort of like gross to me. And that's what I got from this, is that it wasn't clear to me that anybody got a raise from working so hard. These two professors were sleeping in cots in their labs so they could work around the clock with this international team of scientists. This seems actually like hard work so that a vaccine could be made and that millions could be saved. Okay, that's awesome. This seemed weird to me because they're just naming professors and PIs like working all night and stuff, but I know for a fact that a lot of graduate students were working so hard. Like postdocs, I heard, were volunteering their time to help with all of the testing. Like, all of these things are literally just not talked about. It's really only the PIs that are referenced. Like, I think in the whole book, he talks about one grad student's work. Like, I know so many graduate students were working on COVID and they just did not get honored in this book. Talks about this guy saying that the experience of responding to COVID-19 became, for his team and for personnel throughout the university, an around-the-clock, 7-day-a-week blur, one that would stretch for months. And then they talked about this woman, Vanderbilt's global safety and security manager, began a string of 16-hour days that would stretch for more than a month without a single day off. So many times they're just talking about amount of hours spent doing something. We're all working insane hours, recalls Executive Director of Digital Strategies Lacey Pascal. Up until after the end of the semester, it was not unusual for me to be on the phone with Steve Ertrell at 11 o'clock at night because an email had just gotten approved and we needed to send it out to the community that night. And that was the usual. Most days of the week, we were working early mornings and late nights because things were happening so quickly. I would try to go outside for a walk for mental health, and I'd get to my sidewalk and something would have happened. And it was like, we need to get this message out right now. COVID was dramatic for universities. I'm sure like the response and everything was, but like this seems sort of over dramatic, and like this woman can't take a walk without being interrupted with like stuff she has to tell people about COVID, like every day. Like maybe I'm not remembering early COVID correctly, but this seems like a lot. And it seems just sort of sad that she's like couldn't even take a walk. But we don't hear about this woman getting a raise. It's just like her life was awful. She worked all the time. Like that's what the takeaway is. Like that sucks. Thanks for telling me that's really shitty. Teams throughout the university continued to work long hours. You do a 14 or 15-hour day and think, I just got here. We tried as much as possible to respect weekends so people could get a break. But in the beginning, I think we'd spend half a day or 6 to 8 hours on the phone or on Zoom on Saturdays, and usually a couple hours on Sundays, trying to figure out what to do next. Okay. Thank you. Is that what they wanted when they sent this to us? Like, just like thank you notes from all of us? Like, thank you for working so hard. A lot of people worked really hard. People lost their jobs. People died. Like, do you want a cookie? I just don't understand why they're talking about it so much. Another one, from the day students were sent home through the summer, our managers didn't take any vacation, says blah, blah, blah. They were working on a rotating basis, but even when they were home, they were having to plan for when they came back. So really, they worked 7 days a week, nonstop, all day, every day, with no mention of these workers getting a raise. And I just feel like, I'm so glad that they worked all the time. Tracing team members worked 12-hour days, 7 days a week throughout the semester. We pushed our staff beyond reasonable expectations, says Vice Provost for Faculty's Affairs, J.C. George. Fortunately, but not by accident, we have outstanding and loyal staff who worked hard, stayed positive, and gave it their all, despite having to manage the pandemic's impact on their personal lives. Our next task is keeping them and identifying how we can build capacity to shift when the next crisis comes. Our next task is not firing them. You're welcome. Shouldn't it be our next task is giving them a raise? No, our next task is keeping them. I feel like so happy at my job when I'm not actively fired every day. Like, wow. Thank you for that appreciation. Okay, it had cost the university some $40 million to safeguard the campus. It had required faculty and staff to put in a staggering number of hours and to stretch nearly to their breaking points. Are they okay? Did you give them more money? Like, like that lady can't go for a walk. The faculty is to their breaking point. But this is going in like sequential order of the book as I'm naming these different quotes. Building and building to like, we're not okay, we're working all the time, we're not getting raises, but we're not being actively fired, but like we're at our breaking point, but there's no like relief. There's no like resolution. It just seems like people got overworked and are really unhappy. The last one I'll read. Higher education talks about being collaborative, but I've been in higher ed now for a long time, and I have never ever seen collaboration to this degree. We've deployed people who would have never worked closely with each other, and everyone just said, let's roll up our sleeves and get it done. They put egos aside. The work days became 18-hour days, and the people just got on with it. We didn't do the easy thing, she says. We didn't do the popular thing, but we did the right thing. Just really like patting yourself on the back. It's like, not that students like wrote this to our administrators and we're like, thank you, you did the right thing. This is the people who made the decisions now being like, those are really good decisions. It's just not valuable when you're giving yourself feedback. Like, obviously you guys are biased towards Vanderbilt. Like, Vanderbilt wrote this book and sent it out. And they're like, we really think Vanderbilt did a great job of handling the pandemic. You wrote it. It's propaganda. Like, that's what propaganda is, right? So now I'm going to get into part 1 called The Storm Breaks. And I wanted to go into positive things because, again, I like Vanderbilt for the most part. They employ me. It wasn't my intention to go through the book and just like say mean things about it. So I also wrote down positive things. I will say the negative things outweigh the positive. Okay, so first positive thing, they're describing the activities like of life before COVID. They're like, during the week of January 26th, this would be 2020, into the daily hum and shuffle of classes, lab activity and office work. Several PhD candidates defended their dissertations. There was like live music and poetry nights. The swim team was traveling. They're just talking about things that were happening at Vanderbilt a month and a half before our life sort of shut down. I thought that was a nice way to put everything in the context of what was happening, to kind of try to show how everything has changed and how, like, you know, seemingly this crazy thing was like barreling towards us. And I think a lot of us didn't even realize it, like how much our lives were going to change. So they talk about this Greg Sankey guy. He said, listen, you all understand the challenge, right? We're building this bridge at the same time we're crossing it. I think that really summarizes how COVID had to be handled. Talk about how on March 20th, the university announced it would refund housing and dining fees to students who had left campus. It also launched a student hardship fund to provide financial support for those experiencing pandemic-related difficulties. I don't know all the details, so I'm going to say, as how they're describing it, that sounds like a good thing Vanderbilt did. Now sort of into the negative things. Seems like part one is simultaneously Vandy's way of justifying why they shouldn't shut down earlier and also distracting you with vaccine research done at Vandy. So it's sort of in this weird order where they talk about how, oh, we didn't shut down when we maybe should have shut down, but we also like developed the vaccine. Sort of like we did something sort of bad, we did something really good. Like it's like a back and forth. Like March 13th, March 20th was when things started to be like, all right, we might need to shut this shit down. So like right before that was Vanderbilt's spring break. So like the week of March 13th, like the week during that, like, you know, second week in March, let's say. And so Vanderbilt has one of the earliest spring breaks of universities. Like basically in this book, they're talking about how a lot of universities were looking at Vanderbilt for how to deal with this, because the options sort of were, well, tell students not to come back from spring break. Obviously, COVID is becoming a thing. It might be smart just to say, hey, stay home instead of all collectively bring your germs from all over the world back to Tennessee, back to Vanderbilt. Students came back after spring break. And so a lot of the part one is them trying to justify like why they let students come back. Suzanne Wendt, who was the interim chancellor during a lot of COVID, what she names for why they let students come back to campus. Let's count them out. 1, we were the first out of the gate among colleges releasing students for break and having them return. Okay. 2, the first case in Tennessee wasn't until late in the spring break week. Okay. 3, because many students were already returning to campus. Okay. And of course, the tornado that happened demanded immediate attention also. This is her time to make a compelling argument. Like, apparently this is important. We have to talk about it. We had to write it in a book and send it to you, and you had to read it. This is your time to tell everybody at Vanderbilt, all the parents and kids, why you let them come back from spring break, March 2020. And those were the reasons? What? We were the first out of the gate among colleges releasing students for break and having them return. Okay. You could have still made the decision. You were the first, but like you should have still made the decision. 2, the first case in Tennessee wasn't until late in the spring break week. So it was still before they came back from spring break. Like you still knew there was cases in Tennessee and still brought them back. Reason 3, many students were already returning. Couldn't stop them. It's because you let them return that they were returning. And the tornado had just happened. And like, I'm not trying to diminish that, yes, COVID and tornado for Vanderbilt is a lot for the Nashville community. I'm not diminishing that. I'm just saying that you had all this time to think about a compelling argument of reasons why you let students come back. And those were the 3 you came up with, like, and wrote it down and then sent it to everyone. Like, do better. Like, that is not very compelling. With this thing I'm about to read, I kind of wrote next to it, like, did this conversation really happen? So ultimately, the university's decision came down to a basic question. What are we going to do to be sure our people are as safe as possible? That was the fundamental guiding principle that Suzanne Wendt recalls. I remember the Board of Trust telling me very clearly, spend what you need to spend, take care of your people. I had a mandate to do what I needed to do. It's hard to believe that they were like, spend any amount of money, do what you have to do to keep the people safe. Like, I think it's the propaganda tone of this book that makes me incredulous. Maybe that conversation did happen, but everything feels like a lie. Like, they talk about all the safety precautions for COVID, and then they're like, students failing to take those steps were subject to immediate disciplinary measures. They reference something there, and I was like, well, what were the measures? And it's like, anytime we determine that you have failed to comply with this self-isolation directive, furnished false information to the university, or not reported complete and accurate information about your travel and personal contacts, you may face major disciplinary action up to and including separation separation from the university so that we can continue to protect the health and safety of our broad community. If you know of other students who may have had contact with someone who is infected with COVID-19, please let the Office of the Dean of Students know right away. Okay, I get that like we need to shut it down to keep people safe, but like the tone is like very sort of violent, and they're like telling people to tell on others. And in the Vanderbilt Hustler article, they do kind of reference that, saying many students recounted feeling uncomfortable about being expected to police their peers. It's just like a funny tone of being like, we're gonna do whatever it takes to take care of our people. And then in the same breath being like, but we're also going to make you guys police each other and report to us and expel you if you don't listen exactly to the rules. I talked about like the representation of grad students in this book basically being non-existent. Like no research of grad students is talked about except one. Grad students involved in the vaccine research, none of their names are said. No postdocs, none of their names are said. So I thought that was a little annoying. But also when we are referenced, just in a way that's like sort of like we're chickens with their head cut off and they need to guide us in the right direction. This is talking about how Vanderbilt had to handle students living abroad during the pandemic. Like when it first started, like they need to come back, like they can't be out of the country at this point, like everything's about to change. So here's a little excerpt. So not all students were eager to abandon life abroad. One group of graduate students waited too long to try to return home and ended up stranded for weeks. Several other students opted to ride out the pandemic in New Zealand. So we always had a few cases where students would say, you know, I think I'm just going to stay here and do my thing and I'll be fine, this woman recalls. And we're left in a position of trying to explain, well, what if someone in your family gets sick? What if you have a health crisis of your own? Now is not a good time to get an appendicitis. She tried to gently stress the students that if cities locked down or borders closed, they could be beyond Vanderbilt's help. Grad students are like, I would say, I'm just making this up, but average age probably like 25, 30. Like grad students are not like children, but she's like, having to tell them like, well, you have to think about your family, right? Remember your family. What if something bad happens to you overseas? Like just the way that her describing how students were like, sort of like, no, we're not going to come home. We're not going to do this. We know what's best for ourselves. One option is that maybe they did know what was best for themselves and that they're adults and they can handle it. The second thing is maybe this was one conversation with a grad student and they used it as representative of how the grad students were acting who were abroad. And that's another thing that they do in this book where they like talk about one story of an anecdote happening and how it's sort of representative of how that population of people were acting at that moment without like a reference, any data, like, we took this poll and 30% of graduate students wanted to return and 70 didn't. Like, there's nothing like that. It's just like this probably happened with like one graduate student or something. And now they're acting like, well, we had actually rescue all these dumbass grad students. Like, I don't know. It's just not a great tone of how you're talking about students at your school. You know what? I'll give it to Ryan Underwood. He is trying to make this very dry material exciting. They're talking about like in the beginning, I think January through March is like where part one is. Like, but they're trying to make it exciting, like all the chancellors talking to each other and having Zoom meetings and emailing and calling about COVID. But they're trying to make it exciting because like they were taking calls in places that weren't their office. When he reached the guy, it was a difficult conversation, not only because of the subject matter, but because the guy was at a noisy roller rink with his son's grade school class and had a hard time hearing. But he heard enough to understand Morrison's concerns and agreed to take them to Copstain right away. Searching for the quietest place in the rink, the guy wedged himself into a nook housing an ATM. That's crazy. This man had to take a phone call at his son's birthday. Like, okay. And then the guy is like, so after I talked to the guy at the roller rink, I had to call this person who had to dash out from the salon, her hair still wet, to take the urgent call from the privacy of her car. Her hair was still wet and she took a phone call? Shit, that's insane. Like, it's okay that this book is boring. It's just let it be boring. It's not that exciting that someone took a call outside of their office. We wanted to make sure the university spoke with one voice. Vanderbilt centralized all communications. Everything now came through Steve Urchel's department, and the main channel for all COVID-19 related information was the university's coronavirus website, which communication staff transformed from a single catch-all page to a comprehensive standalone site in one intense 18-hour push. Again, that's just talking about the number of hours someone worked on something to be like, look at the labor. But literally, I'm just saying that like, we wanted to make sure the university spoke with one voice. So we made a website. That would have been groundbreaking in the early 1980s. Like, damn, y'all made a functional website, like, online? But this was made in 2020. Like, pat on the back, you made a website. Like, thank you for writing it down and sending it to me so I could read about it. Board of Trust Chairman Bruce Evans remembers March 5th being the real 4-alarm fire bell. It was that afternoon that a member of MIT's Board of Trust, who was also the parent of a Vanderbilt student, emailed Evans. They'd seen Susan Went's announcement, like about how Vanderbilt was handling COVID, and wondered if Vanderbilt ought to be doing more. That was a moment when it felt real, Evans says. Okay, the time that he's talking about, March 5th, 2020, I looked it up. The amount of COVID cases was already almost 95,000 cases worldwide. Okay, so it's a thing. People are dying already. But this guy knows it's real when a member of MIT's Board of Trust emails him and asks, could Vanderbilt be doing more? And he's like, this shit is real. I'm calling this quote Assemble the Rich because they know best. Because it's like sort of this, the tone is like, you know, the Avengers is assembling, like think of that music. Like they're all like, dun da 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 da. Da, 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 like that sort of thing. They're all coming and like, you know, flying in and doing like the Superman like crouch, like it's exciting. But it's like the just weirdest people. They're like, okay, so we had to do an ad hoc committee on university COVID-19 response. So like the music's playing now. So after the board had empowered like the interim chancellor Went and the rest of Vanderbilt's leadership to do what needed to be done during an incredible 7 days of crisis, Bruce Evans was now forming the ad hoc committee. It's like dun, da, 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 to keep the board informed and involved in what lies ahead. Like the adventure is building, like the ad hoc committee is being built. Like shit, who is on it? Nora Wingfield Tyson. She's a retired vice admiral and former commander of the U.S. Navy's 3rd Fleet. Like that one sounds pretty cool actually. Went. This guy Balzer, I can't remember who that is. Incoming Chancellor Daniel Demir. Trustees Douglas Parker, who's the chairman and CEO of American Airlines. He should be helpful. And then Jeffrey Rothschild, former vice president of infrastructure engineering at Facebook. Maybe he could build another website. Alex Taylor, president and CEO of Cox Enterprises. I don't know what he's gonna do. Ike Lawrence Epstein, senior executive vice president and CEO of Ultimate Fighting Championship. Like, we got the CEO of American Airlines, so we got it handled. Like, thank you. I think they wrote this book for these people to be like, look, we put your name in our book. Remember that time we made a committee? I'm not supposed to be reading this. The CEO of American Airlines was supposed to be reading this. That's why there's a disconnect. This part I'm calling, did this quote need to be written down and put in a book and mailed to every person at Vanderbilt? And I don't want to make fun of people, but you wrote it down and sent it to me, okay? So I sort of have to. Copstein recalled what it was like to be confronted with tornadoes while simultaneously scrambling to respond to the growing threat of COVID-19. It was like, are you kidding? We're about to have this global pandemic come to our doorstep, but oh wait, we have this big tornado to deal with, period. Well said, Copstein. Well said. Zoom played an important role enabling dozens of homebound managers from across the universities to meet. It was very tactical, operational stuff. It wasn't? Why are you saying it like that? Okay, and this section is literally called Stuff That Made Me Giggle. Maybe this part is just, I'm immature, and that's on me. Maybe you guys know this saying. I don't. Susan Went shakes her head now at the finger in the dike hopefulness behind the idea that if the university and the nation just managed travel, it could keep COVID-19 away. Have y'all heard of that saying, finger in the dike? I Googled it. Finger in the dike. It's a phrase. Attempt to stem the advance of something undesirable. Google used it in a sentence for me. Thank you. Don't let people criticize you for this. After all, the hurricane was over, and what the heck could you do? Put your finger in the dike? I guess it is a saying, and maybe I'm just like a toddler, but they have a bunch of references in the book, and they're talking about this one thing. They're like, researchers from all the university schools and colleges were involved. And then there's like a little number to go to a reference in the back of the book. Okay, so I'm like, cool, I want to know like what researchers were involved. Like, I wonder if they're finally going to name grad students. I'm interested. So I go to that reference. It is a reference to a PowerPoint slide that on a Susan Wentz like PowerPoint presentation that is not publicly available. I've never seen in my life somebody reference a PowerPoint slide that's not like a reference. And also, like, it's not publicly available, so I can't go reference it. It's like being like, I heard this, I saw this thing, and now I'm gonna use it as a reference, but there's literally no way you can see that thing. You're just gonna need to trust me. It's just like, it's silly. It's very silly. That is just part one of this video series, because this book, again, is like barely 200 pages, but it is a rich text filled with the craziest shit I have seen. Like, if you liked this video, please make sure to like, comment, and subscribe. If you read this book, let me know what you think. If you're gonna read it now because of this video, let me know. So I still have to talk about how Vanderbilt describes the BLM protest, describes the Nashville Christmas bomber, how they describe policing on campus. It's a lot of stuff in here, how they describe how they basically handled COVID, and it's all working out, even though we're still living through COVID. I will talk about how they also justified why they wrote this book before COVID was over. So if that sounds interesting, please make sure to subscribe and stay tuned for part 2. And I will see you guys next time. Goodbye.